Hello, let me introduce myself. My name is Martine Monksfield, and this is my sign name. I'm deaf bilingual, so I use English and BSL. I've had a cochlear implant since the age of 19. I'm currently working as an advisory teacher of the deaf for Haringey and Enfield. On the 19th of March 2021, I'll be taking up my post as President of BATOD. BATOD stands for British Association for Teachers of the Deaf. It's a professional body supporting its members, which includes teachers of the deaf and educational audiologists, so various professions. BATOD is also not a union, and it is not a campaign group. Okay, so let's get started with the presentation. I'm going to start by focusing on the history of deaf education in the UK. So that's Northern Ireland, Scotland, Wales and England. I'll also cover briefly a little bit about CRIDE, which is a consortium specific to deaf education, and I'll talk about their 2019 statistics. Then we'll be looking at a recent survey conducted in January 2021 by BATOD. And finally, I'll tell you about Deaf Teaching Group. The history of deaf education in the UK is a complex topic, and I will try to be as concise as I can in order to keep it simple. There have been a lot of changes in deaf education since 1960. For example, when a baby is born today, they are given a newborn hearing test, so that if a child is found to be deaf, they can be given that diagnosis straight away. But of course, years ago, deaf children were diagnosed as late as age 3 or 4 years old, by which time their parents would have noticed that their child wasn't developing speech or responding to sounds, and would raise concerns which would result in a late diagnosis. The first trial for newborn screening started in 1997, but now it's been fully rolled out so that currently in 2021 all newborn babies are screened by the hospital. Another factor that has influenced change is the advancement of technology, such as cochlear implants and radio aids, which have developed over time, and that goes for hearing aids as well. We've also seen increasing numbers of deaf children attending mainstream schools. As a result, deaf schools and units have reduced in number. Additionally, expectations with regard to academic attainments of deaf students has changed over the years, and we've seen improvements in standards of literacy, and this has resulted in higher expectations. Around 1960, deaf education was predominantly oral. Signing was discouraged, even in deaf schools, where they employed an oralist approach, so signing was often done in secret. This meant that the whole focus of their education was on understanding spoken language and learning how to speak. Consequently, deaf students were not getting enough from their education. In 2003, BSL was recognised as an official language, so it began to be used more widely. In fact, the use of BSL in education was becoming more widespread from around 1990. So, as stated, in the 1960s, deaf education was predominantly oral. However, as time went on, by the 70s, research had revealed that deaf children of deaf parents who used sign language were achieving really well compared to deaf children with hearing parents who used speech. By comparing and contrasting the two groups, notable differences were identified in areas such as reading, maths, and spoken language. The children with deaf parents were doing really well. Some of the research has been open to criticism due to the difficulty in accurately matching for comparison families where the deaf child has hearing parents to families where the deaf child has deaf parents. However, since early research started, it has been noted that there is a marked difference in the attainment levels of the two groups. Perhaps fingerspelling played a part, but that's another area for research. Moving on, here in the UK, two significant meetings were held which had an impact on deaf education. One was held by the BDA, the British Deaf Association, and the other by the RNID, the Royal National Institute for the Deaf. They both looked at language and communication for deaf children. They looked at past reviews and reports by the government, but found that recommendations had been ignored and no changes had been put into place. Many people in the deaf community were very angry about this. In the 1980s, the possibility of using BSL in deaf education was being considered because it was beginning to be accepted as a full language and not merely a series of gestures and mime. So, just like French, Spanish or English, it was starting to be seen as a language in its own right. So, why did the idea of using BSL in education grow in popularity? Firstly, it was being seen as a real language. Secondly, BSL was used not only for education, but also in social and work environments. Thirdly, oral education was resulting in poor attainment for deaf students, and deaf adults were infuriated by this. They felt that they were learning to speak, but missing out on actual education. Fourth, there is the fact that deaf children of deaf parents were doing really well. The final point for consideration is that teachers realised that a bilingual approach to education was a valid one. Growing up learning two languages such as English or French had previously been perceived as confusing for the child. However, teachers realised it was actually an advantage to know two languages and great for the child's cognition and early learning. It meant that they could develop the necessary skills to access education and have a better understanding of what they were learning. This wasn't only the case for spoken languages, but also for children knowing English and BSL. Around the same time, in the 1980s, there was a group called the Natural Oral Group, abbreviated to NAG. At that time, teachers had begun to understand how hearing children learn to speak, and were comparing this to how deaf children acquire these skills. They decided that they wanted to employ the same methods to teach deaf children by focusing on their speaking and listening. So, teachers of the deaf set up the Natural Oral Group in 1981. They wanted to teach young, deaf children to naturally develop their speaking and listening skills through play, using lots of guided support, such as making sure children could see them clearly when they spoke. However, this was only effective if the children had hearing aids or radio aids that worked well. The approach is known as natural oralism. It was intended for use in early years settings, but it was then used more widely in education, which it was not really designed for. Then there is QToD speech. QToD speech focuses on phonics and is a method to support spoken English. it wasn't so popular here in the UK, more so in France and a little in America. There was also auditory verbal therapy, which was popular in the UK. It was particularly used at cochlear implant centres to teach patients how to listen and speak after receiving their implant. Lots of teachers of the deaf still use elements of AVT or auditory verbal therapy within their work. I personally find it can be useful sometimes, and I use elements of it myself, at least in part. Jumping forward to 2007. Sign bilingualism is a term used to describe a child who is being brought up with two or more languages, one of which is a sign language. So, sign bilingual education is when a child is educated using sign language alongside a written language such as English. So the focus on spoken English in education changed, and around the 1980s, when this began to take off, education wasn't focusing so much on spoken English, but more so on the use of sign language and written English. Sign bilingualism became widespread in deaf schools as well as units based in mainstream schools. This meant teachers really benefited, as they were able to use sign bilingualism confidently in schools, unlike in the past, when sign language wasn't seen to be a language at all. So now it was seen to be a fully fledged language. Teachers had the go-ahead to use it in education. BSL was finally recognised by the UK government as a language back in March 2003. It had not yet been given legal status on par with Welsh. However, being officially recognised did mean that tools for the assessment of children's expressive and receptive BSL were being developed. There was greater understanding of BSL as a language. It also opened up the possibility that there would be parity with other modern foreign languages, which would allow teenagers to choose to study BSL as an option in mainstream schools. This rise in popularity was also evidenced by an increased number of ToDs qualifying and subsequently joining BATOD, along with more of them learning to sign and joining BSL classes. Unfortunately, at the moment, it's sometimes difficult for teachers of the deaf to find accredited BSL classes. Often in city centres there is more choice, but unfortunately in rural areas it's quite difficult for teachers of the deaf to find suitable courses in BSL at an adequate level. As signed bilingualism has spread in education and more subjects are being taught in BSL, there's a need for subject-specific vocabulary to be developed. So, there are groups that have been set up that are exploring and creating subject-specific signs, and this work is still progressing. Next, we're going to look at literacy. More understanding is needed of how children acquire linguistic skills in BSL from birth and how they employ these skills when they begin learning literacy. It's important for teachers to share good practice in this area too. Then there is staff training, which ties in with what I mentioned earlier about the challenges teachers of the deaf face when trying to find suitable training in BSL locally, particularly in rural areas. The fourth point is sign language and parents. Deaf bases were established where children could come with their parents so that the parents could learn to sign. It was important that parents were provided an opportunity to learn sign language, and not only when the child begins school, but prior to that, as early as possible, preferably from birth. Some services have great deaf instructors to teach BSL, But some areas do not have this provision, so it's a bit of a postcode lottery as to what services you will get across the UK. The fifth point is SSE, linked to total communication. The term total communication can cause some confusion. One meaning is that you take whatever communication mode the child uses and match that in your approach. More commonly, teachers use a mix of sign and speech at the same time. That's all right if the child understands the difference between spoken English and BSL. But if the child is quite young, aged perhaps only 1 or 2, with SSE they're not able to learn either BSL or English in full. So they're missing out on parts of both languages. For example, in BSL I'd sign I'm going to the shops like this, and in SSE I'd sign I'm going to the shops while saying the sentence in English. When signs support the English, the signs and their structure are diminished, so the child may pick up on this and the English will become unclear. This mix of two languages can cause children some confusion as they don't see the distinction, and as a result, when they try to read and write later on, it becomes difficult. Bilingualism helps to resolve such issues by maintaining a clear distinction between each language, and that's why it's important for teachers of the deaf to understand the differences. By having an advanced understanding of SSE, they will know to take a cautious approach. Signed English can be useful when teaching literacy, particularly grammatical features. For example, there are signs for is, was, were, which can be used to show past and present tense and elements that are important in written English. However, care must be taken when using this approach, ensuring it's always delivered by a highly qualified teacher who has the correct skills to do so. Perhaps in the future, we will have the same BSL Act as Scotland. The BSL Act came into effect in Scotland in 2015. Then Wales recently followed suit in February 2021. However, in England and Northern Ireland, they're lagging behind and we're still waiting for them to catch up with this. At the moment, in 2021, education for deaf children comes under the banner of inclusive education. The vast majority of deaf children are educated in mainstream schools. Many deaf schools and deaf units have sadly closed down. The idea of inclusion or inclusivity can work, but only if all the required elements are present and working cohesively in order to make it successful. It is such a shame that deaf schools and deaf bases have closed down. It is often the case that hearing families with deaf children want their children to go to school locally. This means attending the nearest school rather than travelling farther afield to attend a specialist deaf school. That's why teachers of the deaf are playing an increasingly important role in ensuring not only deaf education is successful, but additionally in ensuring children develop positive deaf identities and are not isolated. Over the years, technology has developed considerably. This includes cochlear implants, radio aids, subtitling on TV, the use of mobile devices, social media and email, all of which have meant huge changes for deaf people. Even more recently, the coronavirus pandemic has had a knock-on effect, meaning that more and more of us are working from home. This has also had an impact on deaf children, who have had to access learning from home as well. However, the technological development that has had the biggest impact on deaf education is cochlear implants. This, coupled with the rise in popularity of bilingual education, has caused some conflict. And yet perhaps they don't need to be mutually exclusive and instead could be used in conjunction with one another. There is a lot of research that shows the benefits of bilingualism. It allows flexible communication and affords more options for students. In both primary and secondary education, when students have a CSW in lessons, they don't have to worry about classroom noise or be under pressure to keep up. They don't have to become so fatigued by trying to concentrate on listening or suffer with cognitive fatigue. So bilingual education means that once they've finished school and go to university, they have a wider variety of options available to them, such as interpreters and note takers and speech to text. Then later on in the workplace, they can make use of government-funded support known as access to work. So bilingualism really opens up a broad array of options in order for deaf children to be successful. If children were limited to an oral approach and that method doesn't work, then what? That brings to a conclusion this very brief whistle-stop tour of the history of deaf education. There is a lot more involved than what we've covered here, but you are welcome to visit the BATOD website, which goes into more depth, and of course there is always plenty of information available to research on the internet if you'd like to know more. Now, moving on to CRIDE, which stands for the Consortium for Research into Deaf Education. CRIDE also has connections with the NDCS, the National Deaf Children's Society. Every year they gather information and data from local authorities relating to deaf children and look at the statistics. This has been completed for 2020, but only for England. So, to get an overview of the UK-wide statistics, I'll be discussing the data from 2019. So in 2019, there were about 54,000 deaf children in the UK, 78% of whom attended mainstream schools, 6% were in mainstream schools with a resource provision, and 3% attended a specialist school for the deaf, otherwise known as deaf schools. 12% attended a specialist school that was not specifically for deaf students, rather focusing on additional needs. 22% of deaf children have additional needs as well as being deaf. 64% of severely or profoundly deaf children use spoken English or Welsh in school. 9% use BSL or ISL. 22% use sign language with speech, so are bilingual. That's 22%, that's interesting. 50% of teachers of the deaf will retire in the next 10 to 15 years. So that's a bit of a worry for BATOD. There is a concern that not enough new teachers are training to become teachers of the deaf. As teachers retire, the numbers are dwindling, so it's a real concern looking forward at the years to come. I'm hoping some of you out there, perhaps you're deaf and you'd be interested in becoming a teacher of the deaf. At the moment, we have 295 deaf resource provisions across the UK. It's a good number, but it has decreased a bit. Now I'm going to tell you about the BATOD survey, which was taken during the first coronavirus lockdown in May 2020, and then repeated again in 2021 in January. If you want to take a more detailed look at the survey, you should be able to see a link which will allow you to take a look. BATOD decided what their next steps would be from January 2021 and came up with a plan. First on the list is support for BATOD members. We recognise the implications of the increased workload since the start of the pandemic, and we will address these through continued meetings with unions and the Department of Education to inform them that ToD's increasing caseload and workload is a concern. We've also entered into discussions over STRB, School Teachers Review Body, which is a report that will be submitted this year relating to pay. Furthermore, we will continue to raise ongoing health and safety concerns regarding coronavirus, for example, through updated advice and discussions with unions. Additionally, during coronavirus, we have seen the increased use of technology. So, BATOD is increasing its influence with virtual platforms such as Google for Education and Microsoft, who have been asking us advice on how to ensure their platform is accessible for deaf educators and deaf children and young people. So this year, BATOD will be offering continued professional development nationally, including webinars, training events. We have a regional and national support forum where members can have access to training on how to use technology in mainstream schools to support deaf children. We will also be supporting trainee teachers of the deaf through mentoring. Of course, coronavirus means that they cannot attend teaching placements in the same way as they would normally. So that's an added challenge, and we have to look at how we can support them to continue their training. Our BATOD website now has resources with information on accessibility, teaching ideas, and we have resources there that you can take a look at. One example is, we've recently reported concerns to the DfE over the use of face masks in education. Lots of local authorities, Teacher of the Deaf services, have their own information and guidance for secondary schools over the use of face masks in education and how to support deaf students and ensure they have access to their education. Lots of services have their own information, and you can have a look at them on our website. That may be useful. There have been some positive developments as a result of changes made during the coronavirus pandemic that we may be able to learn from. One is the use of technology to stay in touch with students' families remotely. Perhaps that is something that we'll be able to continue in the future. For example, if a family lives extremely far away from their deaf school, rather than making that really long journey, it may be a better option to use technology. So we can think about how we can make better use of technology. For me, for example, today, I'm a ToD and I didn't know how to record myself giving a lecture, so doing this is a useful skill I'll be able to use again in future. As a result of this, the outcomes that we've decided on are that we will be continuing to work closely with research partners and charities. We will be looking at what impact the coronavirus has had, particularly on families. We need to find a way to measure that impact, whether it be positive or whether it is an impact on the social and emotional well-being and language development. Many services were unable to continue through lockdown. For example, children's groups. They may have moved to remote platforms, but would have reduced in number, so that there's been less opportunities for children to learn and develop their communication skills and sign language skills. So we need to look at the impact of that, and we'll evaluate additional effects it has had. If you're deaf and you want to become a teacher of the deaf, you can join our deaf teaching group, which was set up by me and Danny Siv in June 2013 as a support network for deaf teachers. Now we also have a closed group that was set up in 2015, which is a safe space for deaf teachers to share their experiences along with information and ideas to support each other. This group is not open to just anyone. There are a few requirements you must meet in order to join. The minimum requirement is that you are a trainee teacher. The group is also only open to you if you are deaf. It doesn't matter if you're a signer or not, all are welcome. However, this group does not include BSL teachers, as we do have a separate group specifically for BSL teachers. So this group is specifically for deaf teachers in mainstream schools, deaf schools, specialist provisions or peripatetic. So if you're a deaf trainee teacher and you're interested in becoming a ToD, please come along and join us and make sure you answer the questions to gain entry. The Deaf Teaching Group Committee was set up in November 2016. I previously chaired the group, but now I've handed over to Claire Nelder. You can find us on Twitter and Instagram, so please take a look. I'm really proud of the group because we set up in 2013 when there was only around 10 or 15 of us, but now it has really taken off and there are around 180 members. Some members are actually from Ireland and Australia. I really hope that it will continue to grow. There are workshops and committee meetings, so it's becoming more and more busy. Now, despite current restrictions, events are still taking place remotely, which has been really great. That's it. I've just very quickly rushed through a lot of information. If you want to contact me, my contact details are there on the slide for you. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.
Empowering Deaf People Through Technology by Michael Lind. I'm Michael, that specialises in supporting people with hearing loss, and I want to quickly talk about exciting products that can help deaf people to work or study independently. Streamer, an automatic captioning platform that instantly produces spoken words in real time on a compatible web browser for people who struggle with listening during lectures, online learning, remote working, and video conferencing with secure private rooms. Sign Glasses allows you to have live sign language interpreted overlay on top of the lecture rooms or office environment through a pair of smart glasses. Could be used for training to be a plumber, mechanic, or doing computer repairs with your choice of interpreters accessed from anywhere in the UK. Duo, a face-to-face communicator creating a barriers-free communication between deaf, hard of hearing, or speech impairment and hearing individuals, sending real-time text back and forth with ease to have a spontaneous conversation instantly anywhere without barriers. These speech-see microphones are intelligently designed to filter speech and noise to capture conversation that's transcribed into text on multiple devices. Each speaker has a unique identification shown in different colors, making conversations more accessible when engaging group conversation. A wireless headset from Wear and Hear for people with mild to moderate hearing loss to engage in conversations, talk on mobile, and hear TV, videos, or music streamed directly to your ears. There are preset settings for indoors, outdoor, in crowds, and live music when using the app. Think Labs, a digital stethoscope that's been designed for people with hearing loss that increases the bass levels to amplify the sound of heartbeats. Could this stethoscope inspire deaf people to become vets, paramedics, doctor, or a nurse? Hope you find these products interesting, and you're welcome to get in touch for further information.